May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of my hearts be acceptable in your sight, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Nick, for such thoughtful and nuanced readings of these difficult passages. The Old Testament parable about the potter's work at the wheel, forming vessels of clay. These are difficult and confusing readings, and I've wished 1,000 times that someone else were preaching this Sunday. I didn't think Susan. Jeremiah's potter's parable puts words in God's mouth that are really harsh. Look, I am a potter shaping evil against you and devising a plan against you. Jeremiah's prophecy words. It almost sounds like God has joined the other team. And then Luke's gospel surprises us this morning with this shockingly straightforward announcement. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. And then there was that whole possessions thing at the end. Is this the same Jesus who says, suffer the little children to come unto me, and tells us to love God with all our heart and all our minds and all our strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves? Well, yes. Confusingly, yes, even in the same gospel. So how do we make sense of these seemingly different messages from God? For me, putting the words hate and evil in God's mouth is really problematic. And I've always had trouble with this particular gospel that seems to say that hating our closest family is a condition precedent to being a disciple. And that is the incredibly frustrating but ultimately spiritually satisfying, even thrilling beauty of being a lectionary preacher and of being a lectionary congregation. See, that is a preacher whose church uses a specific collection of readings for a given Sunday. Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel readings. A lectionary preacher can't avoid looking at disturbing reading right in the eye, or skip a passage that is confusing or challenges her cultural paradigms or even her foundational understanding of God. The lectionary discipline of Scripture, which is the story of humanity's relationship with God, is where we work out our relationship with God, each other, with the planet, when each of us is so differently made in God's image. In the Jeremiah reading, as Duke Old Testament professor Joe Bailey Wells points out, the whole point is the potter's, God's relationship with the clay on the potter's wheel, not God's strong warnings to that clay. Scripture is full of stories where the clay on the potter's wheel answers the potter. From Job, remember that you fashioned me like clay, and will you turn me to dust again? Or from Isaiah, does the clay say to the one who fashions it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles? How about Psalm 139 for this morning, one of my very favorites? You knit me together in my mother's womb. You knew my innermost parts before they were even made. Your works are wonderful, and I know it well. In Jeremiah 18, this morning's reading, it is the very resistance and responsiveness of the clay, that's us, that matters. St. Martin in the Fields vicar, Sam Wells, also writes about God's work in forming us in what he calls the art of congregational life. The gospel is not about striving to return to some kind of unblemished perfection, Sam writes. It's about trusting the Trinity to bring us into renewed relationship with God and with one another, transforming our nature by the riches of God's grace. The art of congregational life is about starting with who we are and and what life has given and done to us, and discovering together, through the imagination of God, a form we would have never otherwise assumed. Our gospel reading this morning grabs our attention just like the Old Testament lesson did with Jesus' shocking warning that discipleship isn't easy. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father, mother, sister, brother, children, and even life itself cannot be my disciple, Jesus says. So the book of Genesis gives us the story of Jacob, our ancestor in the faith, who loved his wife Rachel and hated his wife Leah. Same word. We know from the rest of the story that Jacob did not have actual animosity or ill will towards Leah. His beef was with Laban, his father-in-law, their father. But he did work for 14 years for Laban to earn the right to marry Rachel. So when Laban instead substituted Leah and made him work another 7 years, of course there was a statement of preference and priority, as well as a marker for Laban's trickery in dealing with Jacob. But it wasn't animosity or ill will. Nonetheless, hate is a very strong word, and we have to wrestle with that, especially when applied to our very closest relations, and even life itself, as today's gospel clearly says. This is meant to be a mic drop moment, to make sure we're all really listening. It's supposed to break through all of our contexts, all of our different experiences and different cultural understandings, and shock us out of our complacency no matter what our past experiences are. This is, as the lowest common denominator, an attention grabber. It's meant to find us all where we live. AME preacher Bill Lamar writes, the word translated as hate does not mean anger or hostility. The implication is rather that when conflicts arise as a result of discipleship, and arise they will, discipleship must be chosen over all human relationships. Does Jesus' strongly, sharply worded statement on the cost of discipleship require us to shun our closest relations? Absolutely not. Remember the context of everything else Jesus says and does, even and especially in Luke's own gospel, where Jesus is preaching and teaching and healing and casting out demons and forgiving and inviting and including, all without judgment. That is what discipleship is, and there's not a word of animosity or a breath of ill will in that. This story is Jesus' mic drop moment, his attention grabber that's designed to shock us, whoever, wherever, and whenever we are, no matter what our context. Because discipleship is important. That's the message. So what does discipleship look like here in our times at Emmanuel? When Jerry and I were in London last month, we walked along the Thames River from the tube stop at Emmanuel, right by Westminster Bridge and the Palace Parliament. Walked down the river because we wanted to go to the Tower of London where the wildflowers were blooming in the mud. And it was glorious when we got there, but I'll tell you what we saw along the way. What we saw along the way was a 12th century church. Records go back that far. St. Nicholas Pole Abbey, rebuilt by Christopher Wren in the 17th century after the Great Fire of London, and rebuilt again in the 20th century after it was destroyed by the Blitz. It's perfectly restored. It offers a lunchtime ministry for the workers, professionals, business people in the area. A cafe called the Wren, cleverly, Cafe, and the beautiful front on the coffee counter, the service counter, and the beautiful cappuccino machines and all of that, has a tiny little wren for Christopher Wren, and It's very subtle, very lovely, and it all fits beautifully in the architecture. They serve coffees and pastries and sandwiches and soups in the nave of this beautiful 17th century redone church. And it holds a bookstore, a reading room, and a conversation area. Later, we were back at Trafalgar Square and spent time at St. Martin in the Fields, which is well known worldwide, as everybody knows, for beautiful classical music performance, broadcasting, and recording by the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, as well as for its homeless ministry, as well as for the congregations and Vicar Sam Wells's public theology, which is fueled and made possible by the very diversity and interaction of difference in that holy place. It has a life these days as a meeting and a training center, and its direct engagement in important conversations through all kinds of difference give it life and breath in its times. So how will we at Emmanuel take on our discipleship? How will we at Emmanuel enter into a responsive relationship with God as we gamely take on these lectionary texts that shock us, as we form relationship with each other through difference in experience, perspective, and culture, as the potter turns us into responsive vessels of the Spirit on the potter's wheel? I don't know, but we have these beautifully, acoustically resonant spaces. One of the loveliest arts and crafts period gathering rooms in the region, and a really nice, upgraded, remodeled kitchen. I wonder if I smell coffee brewing. Amen.